Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guests are Eric Segall, Kathy and Lawrence Ash Professor of Law at Georgia State University College of Law, and Adam Feldman, creator of the Supreme Court blog Empirical SCOTUS. We will discuss their article, The Elite Teaching the Elite, Who Gets Hired by the Top Law Schools, which will be published in the Journal of Legal Education. So welcome to the show, Eric and Adam, and specifically, welcome back, Eric.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I may have been one of you first, and you were all ready to go from the outset.
Thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm really excited about this as well, because I think this paper makes some really important observations about legal academia and especially about who gets to participate in legal academia. I wonder if we could start by just having you describe your research question and sort of why you asked it and how you framed it.
So this was originally, I think, my idea, and it had been something that had been bothering me for a long time, because I hold a lot of conferences and I do a lot at Georgia State. And I'm lucky enough to be able to bring people there and that kind of thing. And I read a lot of resumes. So this was not an empirical thing, but it felt like every time I had somebody from a top 10 ranked law school, they went to a top 10 ranked law school. And over 10 years, this just seemed, I've been doing this a long time, Brian and Adam, 29 years. Over the last 10 years, it just seemed like this always happened every time. And I knew that couldn't be right. So I asked my research assistant to begin the process of doing the data mining to see what it was. And the numbers came back extremely startling. So I knew I had a paper, but I also know my limits. And I am not a data person. Adam will attest to this 10 times over. I don't deal with numbers very well. I can understand 95% of something. That's about it. So I looked around, and Adam was, and I had known each other on Twitter, and I loved his work on empirical SCOTUS. I think it is so important. I called him and said, I know this is not your thing, but I really need someone like you. Would you be interested? He said yes, at which point my GRA transferred, I think, a lot of data to Adam, and I'll let him take it from there.
Yeah, so Eric got in touch with me and was thinking about this paper. And it seemed like a really interesting idea. And I also had admired Eric's work from afar for a while at that point. And he seemed like a really interesting and engaging person to work with that was looking at questions from a little bit of a different perspective from my own. I tend to look at things quantitatively in terms of statistics. And Eric, he thinks about big ideas and how they affect law.
Definitely not statistics.
And clearly not. But this also touched on a research interest of mine kind of tangentially, where this was looking at how people come into legal academia. I'm really interested in the study of judicial behavior. And judicial behavior is often framed in terms of academics, and academics become judges. So there were a lot of links between kind of the genesis of this project and what it discussed and thought about, and some of the strands of my research as well. So it seemed like a really interesting thing to jump in on.
And Brian, let me just add right at the top, because I have to do this. This paper would not have been written, or at least not by me and Adam, were it not for Mark Tushnet. And let me just explain that really quickly. When I had this idea, and the numbers came in, we'll talk about the numbers in a minute. I'll let Adam do that. But it was going to be, the reality is, if you want to teach at a top 10 law school, you have to go to a top 10 law school, full stop, if you have an American law degree. And Mark Tushnet's been a mentor of mine for 30 years. And I wrote him and talked to him about it, and he had some interesting ideas. But then I said, Mark, I have a problem in that I can't have this sounding like sour grapes, because I can't do that. I need to write a footnote to suggest that, because, and I wish if I should make it funny, if I should make it humorous. Mark helped me write that footnote. the effect of it is that I've never tried to leave Georgia State. I don't want to leave Georgia State. This is not about that. This is about diversifying the top elite ranked law schools for very important reasons. And it's not personal to me in any sense other than I want those schools to turn out better lawyers for all of us.
Well, so maybe you could talk then a little bit about how you structured the study in question and sort of in a big picture sense, what your findings look like.
I wrote a lot of text about the numbers, the preliminary numbers. Then Adam checked and rechecked the numbers, and I'll let Adam go through the numbers.
Yeah, so the kind of original idea was to look at the top law schools and to see where the professors were coming from, where they'd gone to and graduated from law school. And our hypothesis was that there was going to be an extremely skewed percentage of the teachers that had went to top 10 law schools, and especially skewed towards Harvard and Yale, who are kind of known to be the feeder schools to legal academia. But I wanted to kind of expand this to a greater breadth of schools. Eric had already kind of thought about this. For me, this is more about checking for robustness and to make sure that we're not just framing this in terms of a few schools. So we ended up actually looking at many schools within the top 100, not only at the top 10 law schools. And then we were able to make comparisons through sets. So we could actually take schools from 1 to 10 and then compare the percentage of teachers that went to top 10 law schools in those schools to professors at schools that are ranked lower down U.S. News list of top 100 law schools. So I think we were able to take a kind of broad methodology using pretty simple descriptive statistics and say something about legal academia generally, and not only specific to the top law schools in the nation.
So I guess I'll just jump right in and say, after Adam got done with his magic, in conjunction with my GRA, to be honest, at the beginning, if you're not a numbers person, just listen to this one. At the time that we did this survey, which is like 2.5 years ago now, so the numbers are not current, but still, I'm pretty sure it's a pretty good snapshot. There were, for example, 152 tenured or tenure-track professors at Harvard and Yale with American law degrees. 152. All but 3 went to a top 10 law school, and one of those 3 was the librarian. That's an amazing number. That's 149 out of 152. And then it turns out the more devastating number, I think, is, or as devastating, if you look at the top 10 ranked U.S. News law schools, and Adam can tell you more about what exactly, there's some blurriness at 9 and 10. But leaving that aside, 94.8%. So let's call it 95. I do know how to round up. 95% of law professors at those schools went to a top 10 law school. 95%.
We found it's just extremely skewed towards these top law schools, and it also says something, and I think that Eric can speak to this as well, but about the hiring philosophy at these schools. And there's really a normative argument that can be made for when we look at these stark numbers. 95% of the professors at top 10 law schools went to a top 10 law school. When we look at the individual schools in the top 10, all of them had over 90% of their faculty come from top 10 law schools. I mean, the numbers are just pretty astounding, and that says something. Just as when I would look at studies of judges and how judges tend to, especially federal judges, tend to go to similar schools. These professors tend to go to similar schools, and there's something that you get that's homogenized at the point of being in this really unique space at the top.
So, and there were 2 other things that I wanted to say about this. When I was thinking about the article. One is, I'm just not a believer in standardized tests, Brian, and I'm just not, and we don't have to debate that here, but But the reality is, if you don't ace the LSAT, you're never teaching in a top 10 law school, no matter what you do after. Now, Elizabeth Warren got to Harvard from SMU, but effectively, no matter how great a law professor, I was teasing Randy Barnett the other day. If Randy and Erin Chemerinsky, they actually have believe it or not, they have a cousin in common, and they're from the same part of Chicago. So couldn't take two more different people. You could not get two more different people. Take their scholarship and combine it, and they both have incredible scholarship. Erin is the second or third most cited scholar of all time. Put it together, give it, and I'm just not making it personal, but give it to me at this point in my career, or even 10 years earlier. I'm not getting hired by a top 10 law school. Period. Full stop. Just not. I went to Vanderbilt, which is ranked 17. There's one Vanderbilt professor in the top 20 law schools right now. So that was important to me. But I also wanted to mention that before I even called Adam, one was before and then two were after, I talked to good, trusted friends of mine at Yale and Harvard. And I gave them the preliminary data my GRA had come up with. And I said, my GRA is not an expert on this, so I'm going to get this confirmed. But let's assume this data is true. It turned out to be exactly right. I have a good GRA, or maybe we're off by one school. But anyway, and I said, what do you defend this? Because all the people, somebody at NYU too, because all of these people were progressives and not necessarily snoots, and they all defended it, interestingly enough, in a backhanded kind of way. They all said, well, we wish it was different. But here's what you need to remember, Eric. And by the way, my number one administrative contribution to my law school for 29 years has been recruitment. I've run the recruitment committee every year but two we've had one. They said recruitment takes time. I said, really? No. They said recruitment takes time. It is hard. We get 10 zillion applications. We don't have to go outside the top 10, so why put in the extra work? Now, these are really thoughtful friends of mine, to which I said, okay, I get that. But you would never make that article about that argument about African Americans, women, Latinas, gays, and lesbians. You would never make the argument that way about them. No, of course not. No, of course not. No, of course not. Well, but this is just, I'm not sure it's as serious, but this is a major issue for legal education, that the people you're teaching are going to be, the students you're teaching are going to be teaching the students, are going to be teaching the same students at the same places in more or less the same way over time. Change is not going to happen. And they all had regrets, but they all said it's just not worth the time. And I thought, wow.
Well, so I wonder if you could reflect kind of normatively on sort of why you think this is a problem, not just in terms of kind of unfairness, but in terms of actual outcomes. In other words, is this sort of uniformity of who's teaching at top 10 law schools affecting the kind of education that students are receiving, the sort of atmosphere at the schools? And I guess I also can't help but wonder whether the lack of diversity in educational background has kind of knock-on effects with respect to diversity on other criteria that people might consider more salient.
So a couple quick points, and then I'll turn over to Adam. One point that I think Adam and I shared is there is obviously a serious class component to this, and we cite two studies in our short article that talks about the relationship between the LSAT and class. And I don't want to lose sight. This is my personal bugaboo, but I don't want to lose sight of this. If you're 22 years old and really smart and went to Harvard College and have pretty good grades, if you don't ace the LSAT, you're not getting in a top 10 law school. You will never teach at a top 10 law school. That's too early to make that cut. So that's a fairness issue. That's a class issue, because obviously wealthier people do better on the LSAT. As far as the internal workings of the law school goes, something I know a little more than Adam does about, I'm doing this for so long. I think anytime you hire your own at this rate and you don't hire outside a bubble, then you're not going to see change the same way. And, leaving aside Yale, I think Harvard Law School, at least during different times of its existence, is wildly reluctant to change. And given Justice O'Connor's concurring opinion, or a majority opinion, in Grutter, the affirmative action case, Grutter versus Bollinger, talks about how important it is that there is diversity at the elite law schools, because the elite law schools turn out senators and congressmen and generals and judges and so on. That diversity should have a huge class component. And I think a lot of this is about class.
Yeah. So I think building on what Eric was saying, this is a question to some extent about the haves and the have-nots. For me, it goes back to an article that I think was very powerful. It talks about the legal system by Mark Galanter that really talks about those who have resources and those that don't, and that resources create an inherent advantage. And what we're seeing is these bubbles created and really reproduced over and over again. When we have the top going back to the top, the kind of opposite side of the coin is that they're not going to other law schools. So we're not seeing diversity from the top move down, and so that that students in the schools, let's say 25 through 100, they're getting much less of an education from professors that went to top law school. So we're not seeing diversity on the lower ranks, and then we're also not seeing as much diversity on the upper ranks because we have this pull, this magnetism almost from the top law schools pulling back to their own students. So it's not only that there's this homogenization of education, but that it's being constantly reproduced. So there's no real end in sight as long as there's this mindset that there's something essential that is given in the top schools in legal academia, and with no end in sight, this cycle will be perpetuated over and over again.
And let me add one thing to that is not empirical. So no one mistake this for an empirical observation. It's one after 29 years of recruiting. So we get these books from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, of people going on the market. And those books, it's a relatively new phenomenon, maybe 10, 15 years, I don't know exactly. And nowadays, those books are full of people whose resumes and writings and stuff has been massaged and worked on by the VAP and other type of programs these schools have. It is amazing to me how few conservatives are in those books. It's just amazing to me. Now, what I've gotten over the years is someone like Randy Barnett or Michael McConnell or somebody calling me up and saying, this one conservative is good, take a special look at him or her. Well, it's almost always him, but occasionally her. But I do think this is not part of the article. It's something I thought about afterwards, but it's really important. I do think the fact that these top 10 law schools, with the exception of Chicago, are overwhelmingly liberal and progressive, and they back their own students so heavily, also contributes to some degree to what I think, without having done the numbers, is an obvious, incredible imbalance between liberals and conservatives in the entry-level law professor market, where conservatives have virtually no chance unless they have a Supreme Court clerkship, in which case all bets are off. But a Harvard-educated or Yale-educated conservative with conservative credentials down the line, their entry-level chances at most law schools are very, very small. And I think part of that is this problem.
Just to build on Eric's point, one of the interesting things that we talked about, we didn't end up working into our paper, was other types of diversity in hiring in legal academia. And some of this was just because of the difficulty in getting data on racial diversity, on ethnic diversity. But our idea about homogenization in the top ranks it didn't only start with the notion of going to top law schools. It really was this idea of kind of a model individual, which, I think, based off of what Eric just said, is this liberal, generally white male. And so it would be interesting, I think, with the proper data points to kind of test this argument, and was something that we were interested in doing as well, but just didn't feel like we had the proper data to do it.
Adam, I'm glad you raised that, Brian, because I know I speak for Adam when I say the issue of people of color being hired by these law schools, women. We did run the women, and it was about 35%, I think, which is that right, Adam? About 35%.
Yeah,
that's astonishingly low. Those are all major problems, and we're not suggesting they aren't as important. It was just not this particular paper.
Well, I have to say, like, looking at the data and kind of thinking it through based on my own personal observations and experience, and again, this is anecdotal, but it seems to me that a certain kind of law student comes into the law school game fully kind of understanding just how hierarchical and status oriented the legal profession and legal academia is. And that leads them to choose a school like Harvard or Yale, whereas there are a lot of other people who maybe don't have the sort of, first gen students or ones who don't have people sort of advising them on how legal education really functions, who maybe aren't as cognizant of how kind of status oriented the profession is. And as a consequence, kind of choose their schools without kind of taking that as much into account. And then in addition, there's a lot of people who come from circumstances that just don't permit them to take on the kinds of moving life change debt burdens that going to a top 10 school might require, and as a consequence choose schools, lower ranked schools, precisely because those schools are offering them a financial option that's actually manageable for them. And it seems like that has the unfortunate effect of effectively screening out a lot of those potentially very promising candidates from legal academia.
So my Twitter nemesis and friend, Jonathan Adler.
I'm glad you're bringing him up. I was thinking about him as well when Brian made that statement.
I mean, I disagree with some of Jonathan's scholarship. Some of it is absolutely astonishingly great. Jonathan tells a story that he, for economic reasons, I think, he went to, I think George Mason, but I'm not positive. But he got into all the Ivy Leagues, but his life circumstances didn't allow him to go there. Jonathan's scholarship puts him in a place where he could be at a top 10 law school. And maybe it will someday. I'm saying, I'm not even if he wants to go. But the point is, had he gone to Yale with the same scholarship, he'd be at UVA now or Duke or someplace like that. I'm confident, if he wanted to be. And that's a silly cutoff. I mean, it's a silly reason. I mean, again, for those listening, I really want to impress. The number is 94.5%. So, to get past that number, and Elizabeth Warren, I think, was one of them. Maybe I don't know if that's true or not, but it takes someone like Elizabeth Warren to get through.
It's just about 95% in the top 10. It's 80% in schools 11 through 25. When you get through the top 25, you just don't have as many students from top law schools to go around. I mean, so you're really like there's this filtering process, which is not only screening out candidates for the top, but is also limiting the available options for everywhere else. So there just aren't enough students that are interested in legal academia that aren't going to the top 25 schools to even really give much availability to schools 26 and below.
And one number I wanted to point out: all these numbers are astonishing. This is also astonishing. I think I have this right. The top 25 ranked law schools, 50% come from Harvard or Yale. 50%.
I mean, that number really jumped out at me as well, because I mean, the 95% at the top 10 is astonishing and so absurdly high that it kind of is distracting. But I was like looking at the other schools and I was like, wow, I mean, like all of those are super overwhelmingly dominated by top 10 law schools as well. And it almost seems like they're just kind of filling up all the available slots. And I wonder to what extent that's a function of schools seeing hiring on those terms as being somehow beneficial to the prestige of the school, and to what extent it's a function of lower ranked schools effectively not encouraging or even actively discouraging their graduates from pursuing legal academia.
Yeah, those are great questions. I went to Vanderbilt, and when I was at Vanderbilt, before you guys were born, I think, from 1980 to 1983. I don't want to hear if I'm right or wrong about that. When I was there from 80 to 83, Vanderbilt was ranked 17 in the Gorman Report, which used to be the equivalent of U.S. News. Vanderbilt's been ranked 16, 17, or 18 in U.S. News ever since, pretty much every year, or 19. Vanderbilt started being able to hire Supreme Court clerks. That they couldn't do that in the 80s, but sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, they entered that pool. And ever since then, I think, Vanderbilt's, I may get in trouble for saying this, but I don't know if it's known anymore as a teaching school. When I was there, it was known as a great teaching school. But I think they've given that away. And one of the things that I think is happening in the top 25 is if you have a Harvard Yale person with a Supreme Court clerkship and you are ranked 19 or 16 or 12 and you can get that person, you are going to drop everything and get that person.
So interestingly enough, and just kind of tangential to Eric's point here, two other professors that I highly respect and have done some work with that are actually both in political science with a specialty in law went to Vanderbilt Law School. So from a very small sample, it seems possible that Vanderbilt Law is actually turning out social scientists as well, which is not a bad thing by any stretch. One other kind of figure from our paper that I wanted to point out that I think has some really stark implications, because we've been talking about the top 10 so much and talking about the top 10 law schools as feeders for the as feeders for themselves, really. But when we look at the numbers for Harvard and Yale in particular, I think there's something to be said for that, because Stanford gets ranked as is in the top 3 law schools every year. I believe it's been 2 before, but Harvard and Yale both have well over 150 of their former students as faculty in top 10 law schools. The next school after that, Chicago, has right around 50, about a third of the number from Harvard or Yale, and it goes down considerably after that. So not only are the top 10 law schools big feeders into the top 10 law schools, but Harvard and Yale are such juggernauts, they almost make the output from all other schools seem minimal.
And that's a real problem. I mean, that's a real problem, because they each have, both of those great law schools have distinctive things about them that are really good and turn out great students. But they both also have severe limitations, not the least of which is a class-based component. I don't know their diversity numbers. I'm guessing they're low. And, it wouldn't take much, and this is my last point on this about Harvard and Yale. If they changed dramatically, then Chicago, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, Duke would change also. And that's what's so frustrating. And that's why, and these friends of mine at these schools who I'm like family with, families fight. And I told them this, I was so shocked by their answer that, well, why go outside the top 10 when we can fill all of our needs within the top 10? And I said, define needs. So a Yale law professor I talked to, but I could not quote, said to me, it's not surprising we turn out so many law professors. We teach people how to be law professors. And I said, how do you do that? And she said, we teach them how to write good law review articles. And my stomach went to my knees. And I wanted to follow up with, do you teach them how to be good committee members? Do you teach them how to be good recruiters? Do you teach them how to be good teachers, most importantly, and so on and so forth? Turned out she's not one of the friends. She didn't return my call. I just saw her at a conference. But I honestly believe, and this I think we're all going to agree, is a major problem in legal education. What they want are people to write great law review articles. And that should be number 10 on the list.
Well, to make it worse, Eric, the cynic in me can't help but wonder whether great law review articles here isn't being defined as law review articles likely to appeal to Harvard Law Review and Yale Law Journal.
Yeah, I am sure it is. I am sure a spectacular article in Federal Rule of Evidence XX subsection 3 is not getting published by the Yale Law Journal very often.
I mean, I think there's also something to be said for this reproducibility. And so not only is it a nice thing to say that we're hiring from the top 10, so that the top 10 schools are hiring from their own ranks, but the fact that then they have more students that went to their schools that are teaching in top schools. So that not only makes them look good from the standpoint of having potentially scholars who are going to get cited over and over again, but also scholars that went to their schools, their particular schools, that are then teaching in the top schools. So it kind of self-inflates the numbers to some extent by having this penchant for hiring within the ranks.
And then when you talk about, and all I can speak about is con law, federal courts, the related topics. But so every year I get notes, letters, emails from Jack Balkin, from, Barry Friedman, NYU, a bunch of other people at those elite law schools recommending people. And they can, Yale Law School I don't think has a conservative faculty member. Not a single one. Zero is my understanding. Now, maybe that's wrong, but certainly their con law faculty, is all very, very, very left of center. Most of Harvard's is. Goldsmith is there, and there are a couple others, but most of Harvard's is. I don't know about Stanford except for McConnell. Chicago's an exception, and Columbia and NYU are full of liberals. They're going to reproduce liberals, and so Brian, I do want to make the point. This is not the point made in the paper. This is my next paper. I'm hoping maybe Adam will help sometime once we get this one published. It was accepted for publication 2 years ago, but once it actually comes out, I think there might be. I've been trying to figure out this liberal conservative bias. Can I spend 1 minute on this? Because I shared recruitment this year. I shared recruitment this year for our con law position, and I could not be happier. I am ecstatic with joy over hiring Anthony Christ, who's going to be amazing, and everyone knows him, and he's great. This has nothing to do with Anthony. Before Anthony was in the pool, I asked my faculty if they would be upset if I tried to build a pool of conservative applicants, because Georgia State University Law School has 0 public law conservatives as we speak. Not 1, not 3, not 6, 0. Private law, I can't say because they don't talk about public law matters. But in con law, federal court, civil procedure, those kind of courses, we have 0. Anyway, my faculty was not as excited as I might have hoped. We're a family, we get along very well. But they did say, sure, go ahead, build a pool. So, which was nice. So I called Michael McConnell, Randy Barnett, Jonathan Adler, a couple other law professors, and I even had Randy put me in touch with the person who's ahead of the Federalist Society's legal education division. And maybe it's not been totally lost, and I'm kind of at loggerheads right now at the Federalist Society. But I even talked to her and said, send me your people, send me your droves. I need applicants. I need so many applicants, my school can't say no. At the end of the day, we had, and again, Anthony is, walks on water as far as I'm concerned. We may have had 50 liberals, I think all of whom could have been great. Not as great as Anthony, but they would have been great. We had 3 conservatives. I had McConnell and Randy and Jonathan and the Federalist Society sending me people. We found 3. Now, there was a 4th who wasn't on the market, who I would have taken a very serious look at. There's a 5th who I reached out to as he's a more experienced law professor. He wasn't interested. But in the entry-level pool, there were 3. I think what we're talking about today is directly relevant to that problem, and that's a problem.
Well, just briefly, I wanted to return to an observation in the paper that I found really troubling, which was the extent to which LSAT scores are de facto driving legal education hiring, not only at the top 10 law schools, but it seems to me kind of at law schools across the board, which I think for reasons that we ought to be concerned about because there are really serious diversity issues there. But I also wanted to note kind of just, even to the extent that people might think that arguably there even is some predictive capacity there, at least anecdotally, I've noticed that an awful lot of law professors, even law professors who have gotten hired out of top 10 schools, turned out to be transfer students, implying that their initial LSAT scores actually weren't all that, but they managed to transfer anyway. And so I guess my question is, even to the extent that we care about the quality of legal scholarship already produced in the hiring process as an indicator of future scholarship, does law school ranking actually do much in terms of predicting the quality of even the legal scholarship that people are going to be producing?
Those are great questions, Brian. The legal scholarship world to me is so messed up that I don't know. When you say quality, I assume you mean visibility, because most quality legal scholarship is in the Georgia State and Tulsa and Florida law reviews, not the Harvard, Yale, and Stanford law reviews. The visibility is in the Harvard, Yale, and Stanford law reviews. And I also want to say about the LSAT, I'm not sure. I need the numbers to react to your position, because my guess is, although there are many law professors at top 10 law schools who transferred from a non-top 10 law school to a top 10 law school, my guess is those numbers are small compared to the people who started off at a top 10 law school. And if you don't ace the LSAT, you're not starting off at a top 10 law school.
Yeah, I think that the way we define quality has some significant implications here. So we might think of what the goal of the scholarship is. Does reaching the goal mean it's high quality? Do citations matter? Is having it cited by a federal court or the Supreme Court, is that the highest watermark of a quality paper? So I think that the dimensions by which we define quality matter, and if quality through citations makes a difference, then there probably is something to be said for people that went to top law schools, because they're being taught by the people who have been cited, and they're being taught about the ins and outs of how to write in a way that's going to get cited. And they also have their names associated with these professors and with the judges that they probably clerked with, that already have these reputations. And so there is something about name recognition and reputation that matter also, that are not necessarily at all related to quality per se, but become so correlated with quality when we think of quality as citations that there's no real way to disentangle that.
And of course, we all know that if the Chicago Law Review or the Stanford Law Review is looking at a set of papers, and the resume of one set of papers is I went to Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, or I teach at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, that's going to be and should be, maybe, given second-year students' inability to make substantive cuts, a huge factor. So it's all one self-perpetuating cycle of elites teaching the elites, which coincidentally is the title of the piece.
Well, so in closing, I wonder if the two of you could reflect on, what you see this process looking like going forward. I mean, on one level, are the people actually sort of quote unquote in charge of making these decisions, in your experience, at all concerned about the effects of their decisions? And I guess on a second order, do you see any kind of developments in the legal hiring process, at least potentially affecting the distribution of hiring. And I'm thinking specifically of, at least anecdotally, again, a sort of increasing focus on already produced scholarship in the hiring process, as opposed to sort of the perception of potential scholarship in the future. And Eric, someone you mentioned like Anthony Krice is, I think, a great example of that. I mean, my impression is, I think a correct impression is that a lot of people were really interested in him as a candidate precisely because he's produced so much scholarship that's been so impactful, and that was sort of what made him a really strong candidate. And I wonder if that kind of potential change or expectation might operate, at least to some degree, to the benefit of potential candidates who don't necessarily have Harvard, Yale, or other top 10 schools on their resume.
Well, Anthony does have a PhD, so he spent a lot of time writing as part of that program as well. But Anthony was not, I don't know this for a fact, and Anthony spent time in Georgia, so I know he was partial to Atlanta, but Anthony was not being courted by Duke and UVA. I don't think, because if he had been, I would have encouraged him to go there probably. Not that I didn't want him very badly at Georgia State. I'm going to answer your first question, then turn over to Adam. Look, I sought out the people I thought would be the most conducive to being sympathetic to this issue at Harvard, Yale, and NYU. And very nice, I mean, these are all friends, so very nice discussions and all that. All three of them they basically said, this is not going to change. It's not going to change because there's too much to fight, there's too much standing in the way, and there's too much work. And that was what they all emphasized, that if we enlarge the pool, one quick analogy. I worked for Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher for a year and a half in Washington, D.C., and then one of my closest friends in the world became its hiring partner forever. And when I was at Gibson Dunn, Vanderbilt and Emory were the two lowest schools they would hire at. If you were at a school lower ranked than Vanderbilt or Emory, you had no chance. So I just snuck into Gibson Dunn. And for years, I tried to convince my friend, after I left Gibson Dunn, that you're doing this all wrong, that the number 1 or 2 or 3 person at Kansas or Tulsa or wherever is going to be as good as anybody you find at Harvard and Yale. And he finally took a chance on the number 1 person from Kansas, I believe. That person did great. And from that point forward, though they didn't interview at those schools, they did take those people seriously. So I asked these people at Harvard, Yale, and NYU, but the number 1 person at Kansas law school is going to be great. The number 7 person at Vanderbilt is going to be great. And you're not looking at those people at all, ever. And their answer was too much work. So I'm not optimistic.
And I can't speak to this question from the same perspective as Eric, obviously. Most of my work is currently in the private sector, with a little bit of research writing and teaching on the side. But from a methodological perspective, I think it would be interesting somewhat to have longitudinal numbers so we can look at this question over time. Not that it's likely that there would be much difference if we looked at this over a 20-year period, as opposed to kind of a static point in time, which Eric and I took this question. But, possibly 5 years down the road, it might be interesting to revisit if, as things look like they may be doing, the standardized testing procedures are changing somewhat so that the GRE is becoming a factor where students can take that in lieu of the LSAT, or as computerized testing becomes more commonly available, if the LSAT moves to a computer test where it's adapted to the test takers' answers, this might change the framework somewhat. It would be interesting to revisit this question over time and to be able to make comparisons. Now, if the numbers are 95% in the top, and they remain so, then the answer is things aren't changing. And my guess is if we looked at the past, things would look pretty similar to the way they look today. But although, as Eric said, it's hard to be hopeful that things are going to change at the top. Perhaps aspects of the testing procedures are going to change somewhat, which will kind of force some more diversity, at least, into some of the top ranks if tests make that much of a difference. It's a possibility. It's a small possibility, but it would be interesting to study and revisit at some point down the road.
Well, Eric, Adam, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you sharing these observations with me and my listeners. And I look forward to future work on this subject in later articles, because I think there's a lot to be said. And I think that this is a conversation we really need to be having in legal academia.
All right, thanks for having us, Brian. It's great talking to you today.
Great stuff, Brian. Great preparation. Thank you.